For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Marley Williams. I am the Director of Experiences for the Lesbian Culture Club here in Portland. It's an organization that started about a year ago, and we create and curate elevated events and experiences for the lesbian identified folks in Portland and beyond, and anyone who likes to be in those spaces. So we like to be kind of all-inclusive of anybody who's in this room, whether or not you identify as a lesbian. Welcome from me and the Lesbian Culture Club. Thank you to Living Room Realty for hosting this amazing event tonight for our space. And I'm excited to have you all here. We have amazing events coming up, so if you want to find out more about what the Lesbian Culture Club is up to, definitely check out our Instagram. We have a member-only pool party tomorrow, which is very fun if you want to join. And we do a monthly happy hour, and we're doing an open mic night, and we have an artist event with Lisa Condon as well in August, which should be really, really cool. So check out what we got going on, but we're stoked that you are here tonight because we are here for queer excellence. We are here for queer wealth. Let's go. Bring it on. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce you all to Mel Dorman, who is the author of this very new book that just came out, like freaking today? So financial activist, author, and seller financing expert, Mel Dorman. Here you go. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Marley. I'm so excited to do this performance for you guys tonight and bring this message. I have been working on this for a long time, and it is so amazing to bring this. I am not your typical financial activist. I'm not your typical realtor or real estate investor, as you'll come to see. And that's because I learned how to build wealth very differently than most. When I was in my early 20s, I was living in a slum in Kolkata, India, and I was doing humanitarian work. And what I didn't know at the time was a group of women who were living in that slum would teach me how to build wealth. In other words, I learned how to become rich because of the poor. They taught me. And that's what I'm going to teach you tonight as well. Now, when I first got to India, I had a really bad relationship with money, if I'm honest. I thought rich people were bad, were evil. And I know exactly when I developed that belief system. I was 9 years old, and I had my first slumber party, all-girls slumber party. And I was walking out the door, so excited to join everybody, and my mom pulled me aside. She sat me down, she looked me straight in the eye, and she said, "Are you gay?" Now, I was 9 years old, so I didn't actually know what gay meant, but I could tell by the seriousness in her voice what the correct answer was. You see, apparently my Christian mother thought I was on a slippery slope to hell in a sleeping bag that night, and I was just going to my first slumber party. So what ended up happening is I repressed my sexuality and my gender expression for about a decade. In that community, I didn't belong. I knew it wasn't safe. And go figure, thinking that you're going to hell for eternity takes a toll on your self-esteem. So what I did to compensate for that is I went out to save the world. And that's what I did. I went to India. Now, while I was there, I was working with a social impact business. It was a business that didn't just care about making money. They wanted to create change in a community to solve a social problem. And what we did is we were living in a neighborhood called Sonagachi, where over 10,000 women had been forcibly trafficked into sex slavery, many times when they were just little kids. And we'd work with these women. We'd provide alternative work, making handbags and t-shirts that we'd sell all over the world at places like Whole Foods. And this was the first time that I saw business, capitalism, being used for good. It started to change my mindset a little bit about how to use money. Now, while I was there, I was studying international development, how to help people raise out of poverty. And I stumbled across this guy named Muhammad Yunus. Now, Muhammad was a professor at the University of Bangladesh in 1967. And you can imagine in the classroom, he's teaching supply and demand when just outside the gates of the university, people were starving. So one day, he went to a village nearby named Jorba, and he sat down with a woman who was making bamboo stools. And he asked her, "How much money do you make each day?" And she said, "Just a few cents." And when he asked why, it wasn't because she wasn't working hard. It wasn't because she didn't have a lot of skill. It was because she couldn't afford the $5 a day it would cost to buy bamboo in bulk. So instead, she would go to a loan shark, and they would charge her exorbitant interest, and she would be left with very little money at the end of the day. You see, in third world countries, the poor don't have access to capital. They can't go to a bank, they can't get a loan. And so they have to resort to predatory lending. And once Muhammad realized this, he went all around the village asking each and every one of those women, 42 other women. And do you know what it cost to liberate 42 women in a slum in Bangladesh? $27. Wow. So right then and there, he had an idea. He thought if he provided some financial education, and he put them into small groups, microfinance groups, that they could lend to one another, and they would be held accountable, they would learn together, and they would be good borrowers. And guess what those women did? They paid every single dollar back, proving that with financial education and accountability, the poor were better borrowers than the general public. Once Muhammad established this, he then created the Grameen Bank, which has gone on to fund billions of dollars to millions of women all across the globe. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for it. He believed in the poor. He said the poor are not a financial risk. They're a financial revolution, just waiting to happen, if only someone would trust them first. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, what do we have in common with women in a slum in Bangladesh? How did this teach me anything about building wealth? Well, you see, in America, we also don't have access to capital. Many of us can't buy a home, we can't build a business, we don't qualify. And so, what these women taught me was that I didn't have to rely on that. We live in a world that is becoming increasingly difficult as Americans. In order to buy a home, to make these milestones. And it's because we've been fed this prescription for a long time, and I'm not talking about Ozempic. We've been fed this prescription, the American dream. You see, John Truslow Adams in 1931 invented the term, the American dream. That was well before the American economy was thriving. They were in the Great Depression. And what he believed was that generation over generation, Americans would become increasingly prosperous. It was a beautiful vision. And at first, he was right. You know, if you were born in 1940, you had a 92% chance of making more money than your parents. But by 1980, you had a 50-50 shot, and the numbers have been declining. It's getting harder and harder to get by in America. We've been fed this prescription that if you just go to school and get a career, and you work 40 years of your life, that there's going to be some sort of retirement at the end, that there's going to be security, and it'll be bliss. But the reality for Americans these days is that Gen Z graduates with on average over $100,000 of debt. So it's very difficult to make the milestone of growing a family or buying a home. And then we're told to work our most precious years of our lives, to clock in for somebody else, only to be able to retire at the end if we're lucky. But the prescription's failing Americans. It's not working anymore. Right now, there are 3 billionaires that have more wealth than half of our entire nation. Meanwhile, 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and if you asked 1 out of 2 Americans, they'd tell you they can't afford $500 if an emergency came up. The prescription's not working. And I want to tell you that that's not a personal failure. It's a systemic problem. Perhaps you're here today because you want to learn how to build wealth. Maybe you're tired of living paycheck to paycheck or having to have a side hustle. Or maybe you have a great job. Maybe you have a great corporate job with all the benefits, but you feel like you're constantly climbing the corporate ladder and getting nowhere. You want your time back. Maybe you're like me, somebody who's afraid of how to take care of my parents as they age. Or better yet, some folks might be scared of how their kids will have to take care of them one day. Perhaps you're trying to find a way to grow a family or own a home, and everything just seems hard. You're not alone. You see, the economist Robert Reich explains why there's been a growing disparity in wealth in our nation. He explains that we went from what is called a stakeholder capitalism to a shareholder capitalism. I want you to imagine a stakeholder capitalism is like this. It's a mom and pop shop where they know their employees. They have relationships with their suppliers, their community members. And when they're making business decisions, they're thinking about each and every one of those stakeholders. It's like the 1950s. Think of a diner. But as time has gone on in America, we've increasingly seen not mom and pop shops, but franchises and corporations. And that has a very different structure, because a corporation is not owned by mom and pop, it's owned by shareholders. And so the CEO has one job: to report to the shareholders. They don't know very much or care very much for their suppliers, their employees, the communities where they're working in. They're making their decisions on how they can drive up the profit margins each quarter. And so we've seen this growing divide between corporate America growing in power and the American people losing. The American workers seeing their health care disappear, their benefits, unions dissolving. This is because we've shifted from a stakeholder to a shareholder form of capitalism. Now, the thing is, most Americans keep wealth in their homes. That's how they're able to retire. They purchase a home and it locks in their monthly payment. And as they pay it over time, it grows in equity and appreciation, and they have a nest egg. That's why homeowners have 40 times more wealth than tenants. That's why I believe every person deserves to own their own home, so they can build that nest egg and have that security. But the problem is it's getting harder and harder to reach that milestone. Prices have been rising, interest rates are higher than they've been in decades, and it's getting harder and harder to buy a home. In fact, it's never been more inaccessible. This is the hardest it has ever been in America to buy a home. And what's worse is in 2022, 1 in every 7 homes was bought by a private equity firm. In other words, corporations are turning our neighborhoods into monopoly boards, and they're winning. And that turns us into lifetime tenants because we can't be owners. There's a real cost to this. You know, not owning a home is expensive. Let's take an average size house, priced house in Portland, for instance, $550,000, roughly. In 1 year, in appreciation, you get roughly $25,000, maybe a little more. Plus principal pay down and tax savings, you're looking at around $30,000 in the first year, not owning. And if you expand that over 10 years, accounting for compound earnings, it's about $425,000 lost. So you can imagine how the divide grows between those who are tenants and owners, and how important it is to own. Waiting is not a strategy. And if there's anything I've learned in 2025, nobody's coming to save us, right? We've got to figure this out for ourselves. And let me tell you, as somebody who didn't take action soon enough. You see, when I got back from India, a third world country where I was helping people out of poverty, I came to the United States, a first world nation, to realize that I was the disempowered one. I was a social worker, 23. I got back and I realized that my dad was having a hard time remembering his words, starting to tell stories on repeat. And it didn't take long before the doctors told us that he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Now you see, my dad was 67 years old, the breadwinner. And I come from a blue-collar, middle-class family. Both parents are construction workers. My dad was a roofer for 50 years. And so as a 23-year-old, I was shocked to find out that I had more money in my checking account than my parents had, which was only $10,000. When the doctors told us that it would cost us $7,000 a month to take care of my dad, we were in trouble. I didn't know what we were going to do. That's what Dad brought in, $7,000. So now we're at a $14,000 deficit as a household. So I wanted to figure out, what can I do? I remember going to work, sitting down at my computer and getting a calculator out and wondering, how much are we behind? How much does it cost to retire in America these days? What should we have had saved up? So I punched in some numbers and I tried to figure out, what would it cost if you lived till 90? And it was $2 million. I was shocked. Curiosity got the best of me, so I punched in a few more numbers to find out what it would cost for somebody like me, 30 years younger, accounting for inflation. And the number was $4 million. $4 million. I was a social worker making $40,000. That felt impossible. So I did what any good millennial would do, trying to solve a major life crisis. I rolled up my sleeves and I Googled it. How to build wealth. And that's what led me to real estate. I started listening to all the top podcasts, reading as many books as I could get my hands on. For an entire year, I worked overtime at my job, saving up for my down payment. My social work buddies, they'd tease me. They'd call me Zillow. They thought I was crazy. Which is pretty funny because we were working at a forensic psych ward, so they were pretty familiar with what crazy looked like. But you see, they weren't laughing long, because a few months into my search, I found a duplex, off market, sending letters, handwritten letters to duplex owners, introducing myself. And I'll never forget when the appraisal came back. It came in $50,000 more than I was paying for it. $50,000. Oh my gosh, $50,000 is more than a social worker makes in a year. And I made this off of sending 300 letters with a few $100s of stamps and 30 hours of my time. The light bulb clicked on. Wow, this stuff really works. I was so excited. I mean, I couldn't wait to tell my parents the good news. I realized if I took the money that I had left, that I'd saved up, I could fix it up and I could sell it enough to take care of my dad for an entire year. I was so excited. You see, up to this point, my family had to resort to something I'm not proud of. My sister, who had lost her house in 2008 to the bank foreclosure crisis, one of 8 million people who lost their home because of predatory bank lending in America, she ended up on the streets. She developed a heroin addiction. So my family, lacking the supports that were promised in a country as wealthy as this, had to resort to something I'm not proud of. We asked my drug-addicted homeless sister to move in and take care of my dad as he was dying. You know, I was so excited, though. I'd finally figured it out. And I was just about to call my parents and tell them the good news when my sister called me instead. And she let me know that I was too late. My dad was dying. I'd been too late to help him, and she told me it was time to come home and say goodbye. You know, a few days later, I found myself in a hospital room, holding my dad's hand one last time. And I remember telling him about my duplex. I was so excited. But in that moment, he and I both knew I was too late for him. I was too late to help him. And I felt furious. I mean, he had worked 50 years of his life with nothing to show for it. And so I did something drastic. After I said goodbye to my dad, I walked out of that hospital and I quit my day job. I was a social worker. I quit my day job and I only had $16,000 in my checking account. But watching my dad clock in his whole life with nothing to show for it, I said, I'm not clocking in for anybody's dream but my own anymore. Now, I share this with you not to scare you. I just want to prepare you. You see, I was fortunate that my dad is 20 years older than most of my friends' parents. It's like their grandparents. And so I got to see the end of life much sooner than most. And let me tell you, it's expensive. More expensive than most people realize. And so, I want to acknowledge that the reason we're not prepared as Americans is because we're not given this information. School doesn't teach you about money. We're not told how to budget or how to build a business unless you go to an MBA school. And so we often don't know how to build. We're told to just get in line, to clock in. You know, it feels scary. When you're just told to survive, it feels scary to build. It feels like gambling to invest. And the places where wealth is talked about are often places that don't look like us. The words that are used are foreign. Cap rates, gross rent multipliers. What's that? So we feel excluded from places of wealth. And if you're anything like I was, growing up, I thought wealth was bad. I felt ashamed for wanting more. I'm here to tell you that there are ways to build wealth that aren't extractive, that are additive, that help people. There are ways to build wealth that don't require a lot of money to get started. You don't need special credentials, you don't need an Ivy League education, you don't need connections on the golf course. There are ways to build wealth that help people and not hurt people. I want you to imagine what it would be like if you don't already own your home, what it would feel like to have that kind of security. Not worry about a rent increase or to know that you have a nest egg growing. Imagine what it would feel like to be able to take care of your parents as they age without any worry. So you could just be there for them, present. Or what it might feel like to take a week off of work. Just sit on a beach, breeze in your hair, cell phone off. Not because you burnt yourself out at work and you deserve it, but because you've built a lifestyle by design where it's just baked into the equation. You see, all of these things were hard for me to imagine, sitting at that hospital bedside with my dad. But since then, because I discovered seller financing, I went on to buy 34 rental units with that $16,000. I built six-figure financial freedom in 5 years. I went from making $6,000 a month as a social worker to making 6 figures a month as a real estate investor, an entrepreneur. What these women taught me in the slums of Kolkata is that I didn't need a lender or a bank. All I needed was relationships. You see, when I quit my job in that existential haste, when I only had $16,000 in my checking account, what I lacked in common sense, I made up for in courage. And I didn't have common sense. What I had was uncommon sense. Because before I quit my job, I had just discovered seller financing. I felt emboldened. I found out that you didn't need to go to a bank. You could go to your neighbor down the street. And as long as they owned their home outright, you could sit across the table and learn about what their goals were, and you could strategically create a partnership where you paid them each month instead of Wall Street. And so that's what I did. I just went out and met a lot of people in my community, and I sat and I listened, and I solved their problems. And every time I did that, the money always followed. You see, seller financing is quite simple. It's just making payments to a person instead of an institution, as long as they have equity. And it's really just 2 documents. It's a promissory note. Think of an IOU. It spells out all the terms of the agreement. What's the interest rate? How long until I owe you the full amount? What's the down payment? A promissory note, just a couple pages. And a deed of trust. I love that. It's a promise and a trust. Isn't that beautiful? Between neighbors. Now, deed of trust is what secures that promissory note to a real piece of property. In other words, if the buyer were to get hit by a bus or get sick and die or just stop paying for any reason at all, the seller could sell the property and get all their money back. They're secure. They're safe. And so the beautiful thing about seller financing is everything is negotiable. What interest rate would you like? Doesn't have to be 7%. What would you like the down payment to be? How long until I owe you the end balance? All of that is just a conversation. What do you need? What do I need? Now, the problem is, actually, let me explain this. I really like to use the analogy of a tree when I'm explaining this, and why it's so important for our economy and for us as a community. So imagine every time somebody buys a home, it's like planting a seed. And as they make their mortgage payments each month, it's like they're watering it, and that little seed starts to grow. That's their equity. And some people like to rent out their properties, so it's like a fruit tree. It starts creating fruit, sustenance. Now, over time, landlords and homeowners, they get tired of watering, and so they want to sell. And what we usually do in that circumstance is we cut the tree down. Now, when we do that, there's some costs involved. Like the IRS wants their portion, right? And so think of like all the leaves and the branches, all that goes away. The seller doesn't get that. And likewise, there's a cost of sale, right? You got to pay the realtors and the negotiations and escrow and all that. That's like the stump. The seller doesn't walk away with that either. At the end of the day, when they sell, all they get is the trunk. And sure, they can go use that to keep themselves warm or go buy something else, but it's no longer an asset. It doesn't perform. It doesn't create cash flow. It doesn't continue to grow. Now, seller financing is different. It's like handing that watering can to the buyer. And now they start watering. And the tree keeps growing. And at first, all of that interest, all of the fruit of the tree just goes to the seller as mailbox money. They move from landlord to lender. They become the bank. And likewise, they get to keep hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest that would have ordinarily went to Wall Street. You see, as a community, what we've been doing for a long time is just cutting down tree after tree. And so we look across our nation and we go, why are we struggling? Why are we struggling? It's because the capital is being extracted out of our communities. You know, to grow good quality food, we need to have good soil, right? You need to have nourishment. And the same is true financially. In order to thrive, we need to keep money in our local economies, in our neighborhoods. When we get a loan from the bank, that money and those nutrients leave our neighborhood soil to a financial institution. But when we lend to one another directly through seller financing, then that money stays locally in our communities. Together, this is how we can redirect wealth away from Wall Street back into our neighborhoods. The problem is, whenever I explain this to folks, they think it's pretty radical that I'm suggesting we should trust our neighbors over Wall Street, over a bank, or a financial institution. We've been over-relying on institutions for a long time, and I don't know if you noticed, but they're failing us. In fact, this idea was so radical that I did a TED Talk and I got selected as editor's pick because I had a timely message for the global audience. I went on to write this book to further articulate this message, to get it out there. And I started a program locally called the Seller Financing Academy, where I'm teaching people how to go out there, meet folks in their neighborhoods, negotiate a win-win deal, and then scale their portfolios using other people's money, just like the women in Kolkata did. Financial education and accountability, right? In order to imagine a different way of doing things, in order to build a different system, one that flows wealth horizontally, not vertically, we have to imagine it first. It can't become unless it's first in our mind, right? I mean, right now we are living in the imagination of the people who came before us. Folks who didn't even know what indoor plumbing was. Those are the folks who have designed our healthcare systems, our financial systems, our educational system, our tax system, We're living in their imagination right now. But we've grown so accustomed to it, so conditioned to it, that we often think there's no other way. And so today I want to invite you into a different imagination with me. Let's play. Just suspend your disbelief just for a little bit and play with me. I want to teach you something. Just like as queer folks, we know what it's like to undo the social conditioning that makes us small, that keeps us stuck, that tells us we are not worthy of much, right? We know how to peel off the homophobia, the transphobia, and say, no, I'm okay, I'm good. The same thing happens around money. We have this social conditioning that teaches us to say small, to be afraid, to not have power. And so today I just want to share with you 3 myths. There's 6 of them in my book, but I want to share 3 of them. 3 myths in America that keep us broke and small. The first one is this. It's the one I believed. It's that being rich is bad, right? That girl in Calcutta, 23 years old, I believed it. Being rich is bad. Why? Because I graduated in the 2009 era, Occupy Wall Street. I didn't like millionaires. I thought they were bad people, let alone billionaires. But when my dad had this financial crisis, I realized millionaire is not a dirty word. It's what it costs to retire in America these days. Audre Lorde, a queer black feminist, says, to care for myself is not self-indulgence. It's self-preservation, which is an act of political warfare. In other words, wealth amongst us is resistance. You deserve wealth. You deserve freedom. You deserve the ability to die and to die with dignity, to be able to take care of yourself in retirement. You see, believing that money is going to corrupt you is the quickest way to repel money in your life. Because every time there's an opportunity or something good appears in front of you, you're going to go, I'll stay away from that. That might not turn out well. It's a foundational belief that bars many people from ever making any advances. That's the first myth. That's the one that got me for a long time. The second myth is this: to play it safe. Gotta play it safe. Just keep your money in the bank, use those 401ks, let other people manage your money. You don't want to learn about that. That's too much. I don't have time for that. But you see, keeping your money in the bank is actually a problem. Most people don't realize when you put, let's say, $10,000 in the bank, you know what happens to it? They pay you 1 or 2%, and they immediately lend it back to you or somebody else at 7 or 8. Ooh, if you don't put your money to work, they will. And I don't know about you, but I don't like lending money to people who have lost my money before. As of the 2008 financial crisis, every man, woman, and child lost $70,000 of lifetime earning potential because of bank lending practices. I don't really want my money there. I mean, beyond like an emergency savings, I want to put my money to work so that I don't have to work anymore. The third myth is that you need a lot of money to make money, right? We hear that all the time. You need money to make money. Well, about 8 years ago when I learned about seller financing, I want to tell you the first time that I used it as an example. So it was about 8 years ago. I just quit my job. I'd wake up every morning, literally my knees were shaking. How was I going to make money out of thin air today? And so I'd wake up and I would read my affirmations, and every day I'd read this one that said, I will find an off-market property using seller financing. I will buy it, right? I will buy an off-market property. And I had to, right? No bank was going to give me a loan. I didn't have a job. It wasn't 2007 anymore. And so every day I would go out and I would send mail to strangers. I would door knock. I would cold call. And one day, this gentleman answered. His name was Kelly. Now, funny enough, I was looking for a guy named John, and Kelly let me know that John was dead, so that was a little bit awkward. Turns out Kelly was his bankruptcy attorney. What a great meet-cute story for Kelly and I, though. We hit it off right away. A few months into the friendship, I got a text from Kelly. Now, I want you to imagine, this is a 65-year-old guy from Manhattan, married with a wife. We're very different. But he sends me a text. He says, hey, I got a triplex. I'd love to know the value. Now, at this time, I've got my realtor license. I'm making zero money, but I know how to pull comps. I could tell you what it's worth. So I pull up the listing. I look at it, and I realize he's owned it for over 15 years. And just in that moment, I knew this would be my first seller financing deal. He had the most important ingredient, which is equity. That's what he could lend to me. And so I showed up at the appointment, and we toured all the units, and before I could even say a word, he turns to me and says, I'd like to seller finance this to somebody. It was like manifestation right there in front of me. Would you seller finance it to me? He said, sure. So that night, we went to a bar. It's a Tuesday night. And we ironed out all the details. Now, at first, he wanted $75,000 down. Oh, remember my checking account? So quick on my feet, I said, well, Kelly, you're an attorney. What would it cost for you to foreclose on me if I don't pay you? He thought about it for a second. He said, about $15,000 in Oregon. That's the price. That's the price to take the property back. I said, okay, well, why don't I just give you $15,000 then? If I don't pay you, you can use my own money to foreclose on me, right? So that makes sense. It was a win for him, less taxes to pay. He was happy. Now, I had another problem. I also didn't have $15,000. I still had to pay rent and stuff. I said, well, after that night, I went home and I picked up the phone, and I did what I saw those women in Kolkata do. I picked up the phone and I called everybody I knew, and it didn't take long before a lesbian couple said, we'll give you $10,000. You can pay us back in a year. So I made another promissory note with them too. So when I got to closing, I only needed $7,000 of my own money, $5,000 for the down payment and $2,000 for the closing cost. For those of you that don't know, if this were a bank loan, that would be more like $15,000 for closing costs. Quite a bit of savings there. Now, I had another problem. I had a lot of problems as a buyer. When we got to the closing table, I realized 2 of the units are vacant. And so I told Kelly, how am I supposed to make my payment to you when I don't have any money coming in? Could we delay the first payment by 2 months and give me time to lease those up? He said, sure. So we took those 2 months and we put it on the principal, and he earned interest on interest. So he was winning. And in those 2 months, I leased up those units and I recouped $6,500 of my $7,000. Which meant that I was all in on a triplex near Mississippi Avenue for $500. $500. And it cash flowed. Why? Because we did something called interest-only payments. You see, bank loans are on an amortization schedule, almost always. And if you've ever seen an amortization schedule, the first 5 years is basically interest. I like to call it rent, but with a bank. You're basically just paying interest. Now, with interest-only payments, if you put them side by side, they're quite different. That's the triplex there. It's about a third less, depending on the interest rate, which was saving me about $766 a month doing it this way, which is why I had plenty of money to pay my lesbian couple friend who loaned me $10,000, and I had plenty of money to take care of the tenants, which is very important. It was a win-win-win deal. And after a year, I paid off my friends, and I started cash flowing about $1,100. I went, wow, this stuff really works. I got to do this more. Now, you might be wondering at this point, why in the world would Kelly do this deal with me? Did I get him drunk that night? Did I take advantage of an elderly man? No. In fact, Kelly was a real estate, he was a realtor in his younger days, and he was also an attorney, so he knew a lot more than me as a 30-year-old social worker. And the reason he was willing to do this is because it was incredibly lucrative. Just like the banks want to do it. They want to monetize our equity because it's lucrative. When I bought this property from him for about $725,000, he made over $240,000 just in interest over the course of the next 7 years. In other words, he made almost $1 million on this property, and if he had sold it the traditional way, had he chopped down the tree, he would have had to pay taxes, realtor fees, all of that, and you know what he'd be left with? $560. And then he'd have to go out and reinvest that somewhere. That is a 67-year-old man, not in Wall Street, not a good place. He'd have to get like an 8 or 9% return consistently to match what I was paying him. It's a strategic advantage for sellers to do seller financing. The good news is that right now there are millions of boomers just like Kelly, who are out there, and they have a working memory of seller financing because you know when it was popular last? In the 70s and 80s, right after a major financial crash in the banking system, when people were returning to community. It sounds so familiar. Those folks have a working memory of seller financing. It's probably how they bought their home. Kelly bought his first home, seller finance. That's how he knew. And so these folks exist, and they are equity rich, but cash flow poor. They can't buy the next home at 7 or 8% interest, so they're stuck in their homes wondering, how am I going to retire? And you can help them. Meanwhile, there are so many millennials and Gen Z who cannot buy a home because of student debt, because they have too many gig jobs. They don't have that W-2. They're scraping by. Do you see how this is a beautiful match between the two? That we can solve each other's problems at the same time? About 3 years after I did that deal with Kelly and his wife, Susan, he was a stiff negotiator, by the way. Susan went to bat for me. It's pretty funny. But about 3 years later, it was 2020, and interest rates had dropped. I felt like at 5.5%, I had gotten a bad deal. So I called up Kelly and Susan, who are dear friends of mine, by the way. Now, we were strangers when we first met and did this deal. I called them up and I said, hey, can we get creative? Remember the imagination I want to invite you to. You can do lots of things with seller financing. The sky's the limit, whatever works for you and them. So I said, Kelly and Susan, I still owe you about $700,000 on that promissory note. I have an idea. What if we take that $700,000 promissory note and we divide it in two, like a karate chop? One for $350,000 and one for $350,000. Turn one note into two. Same amount, same payment, just two pieces of paper now. And what I'd like to do is take one of those pieces of paper and collateralize it on other properties I've bought, with plenty of cash flow and equity to support it. Just want to move you from this property to that property. Would that be okay? They said, sure. And with their permission, I took advantage of those really low interest rates in 2020, and I got a 30-year fixed rate at 4.125. I paid them off $350,000, and I did a cash-out refinance, pulling out $200,000 as a down payment on a 20-unit in Ohio, seller financed. You see, I took $500 and I turned it into 23 units. That's the power of seller financing. You can do whatever you can imagine as long as the other person's on board and it benefits them. And for Kelly and Susan, it was awesome. They're able to get $350,000, spread out their capital gains, and I gave them an extra point of interest to incentivize them. That's what it looked like. What I learned from the women in Kolkata that I didn't need a lot of money capital. What I needed was social capital. I needed to meet people, to care about their circumstances, to understand how finance worked, and then solve their problem. As long as I could solve their problem, and when their problem was as big as how am I going to possibly retire, every time I solve that problem, the money just follows. I want to give you a few case studies. Oh, wait, before we do that, actually. I want you to think right now, in your mind, who do you know who is a tired landlord? Who do you know who might have paid off their home already? Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's somebody who lives down the street. I want you to imagine that there are people out there right now who own a lot of their home that you could just go out and meet. I want you to imagine a woman who maybe their husband passed away and left her 6 houses and she doesn't know what to do. I can imagine that because Robin sent some letters 2 weeks ago and that's what she's buying now. Of course, she's getting 6 houses on the first try. I'm not mad about it. I want to give you a few examples of folks that I've interacted with just in the last few months to give you an idea of what you can do with this. So Cynthia called me like in March. She let me know, hey, my mom passed away and she left me a duplex and a triplex, free and clear. And as a realtor, she wanted me to help list the properties. So I showed up and I said, hey, Cynthia, I think the triplex is worth this and the duplex is probably worth $550. And she agreed, yeah, that sounds right. I said, but how would you like to make a lot more money than $550,000 on that duplex? She looked intrigued. I said, you see, if that duplex came with financing, it would open up your buyer pool, and we could drive up the price. And furthermore, if it was an interest-only payment, we could raise that price to $610 and still beat the bank. We'd still have a smaller payment for the buyer. She said, great. You see, Cynthia, her parents owned a grocery store, and they had sold it seller finance. So she knew from childhood the advantages of seller financing. She remembers her dad having to deal with tenants and toilets and grocery problems, and then, just mailbox money. She wanted to have that. She was ready to retire now. And so she told me, in fact, I know who could buy this property. The tenant, his name's Abdul. He's a doctor. He makes $350,000. And he really wants to move his mother-in-law into the bottom unit so they can be one big family. She said he's got one little problem, though. You see, he is Muslim, so he can't pay interest. His religion bars him from it. I said, well, that's no problem. It's no problem when we write the documents, when there's no banks involved. So I called up Abdul and I said, hey, Abdul, would you like to buy this property with a 0% loan? He said, yeah, that sounds good to me. I said, cool. How many years would you like to buy it over? And he said 7. So I got on a calculator and I figured out what would have been the interest and I just added it to the price. So at the end of the day, Cynthia sold that duplex not for $550, but for $725. She made $175,000 more on that property, deferred her gains, and now she lives off that in her retirement for the next 7 years. Meanwhile, Abdul got access to buying property. Now he's an owner. He gets to build. And his mother gets to live in the ADU, and they get to walk to the mosque each week. You see, seller financing unlocks access to non-traditional buyers who don't fit in the bank's criteria, but they're responsible, they're worthy. Seller financing opens that opportunity up. It also helps the seller to convert equity into an income stream so that she could retire. It's a win-win. I have another case study. Sorsha, in the front row here. Sorsha came to me last August, I think, and wanted to do some coaching. And at the time, she said, my husband has quit his job as a software developer. We're sort of scraping by. We're trying to figure out how to build what's called a midterm rental business. That's where you rent it month to month, you furnish it, and folks who are like travel nurses or folks who have lost their home to a fire, they rent it for a few months while their home's restored. And she said, I see there's an opportunity in the market, but I don't know what to do with it. You see, there's been an influx of condos, like 400% of them. Yeah, an influx. Everybody decided to build at the same time. So now there's all these condo owners that are sitting on the market who bought maybe in 2019, 2020, 2021, and they can't sell. They're underwater. And likewise, they can't rent it because the market rent doesn't cover their mortgage. So they're stuck every week, every month, bleeding out. They don't know what to do. So I said, Sorsha, I want you to go meet with them and have a conversation and ask them if they would lease to you as a midterm property management company. And you'd take over. and you'd sublease to these travel nurses. So she went out there, searched all over, met up with people, and they started saying yes. She came back to me. She was so excited. She's like, people want to do this. I said, great. She said, I got another problem. I don't have any money. I said, okay. So I asked her, well, do you have a house? She said, yeah. In fact, I have a little ADU. I have an Airbnb. I said, great. Give me the numbers. Pulled it out. I said, with this amount of income, you could go out and borrow $40,000 from your community. She said, that sounds crazy. I said, just try, trust me. So she went out in a few months, it didn't take long, maybe a month or two. She'd raised $40,000. And she went back to all those folks and she leased 6 of them with an option to purchase later. 6 properties in 6 months. She traded $40,000 of her home equity for $45,000 of passive income for as long as she wants. Because she understood financing. And she went out into her community trying to solve real people's problems. And when she did, the money followed. You see, I help people who feel stuck in this current financial system, who aren't able to get ahead or stay ahead for themselves and their family. If that's you, have a conversation with me afterwards. But more than anything, I just want to equip you to do this on your own. That's why today I'm just giving you my book. I've literally spent 18 months writing this thing, getting it published. It's everything I know about this topic. Because I just want to start a movement. I don't want to sell books. I don't care about books. I'm financially free. I want to start a movement. I want to create change in my community's life. I want to change your guys' lives. I want you to experience financial freedom. And the quickest way to get there that I know is through relationships. Not working harder, not getting a better job, not saving more. It's just meeting people, understanding them, presenting an offer that works for them too. If you want, you can scan the QR code, you'll get a free copy. And I also have a book launch party in about a couple weeks. You're totally invited. My goal is to spread this message. My goal is to teach people that there are ways to build wealth that are not damaging, that are not bad, that actually help people in our community, that keep wealth local, keeps wealth flowing horizontally, not vertically. I believe that we can have a different imagination for wealth. And much like Muhammad Yunus, I believe that Americans are not a financial risk, that we are a financial opportunity. We are a financial revolution, if only someone would trust us first. The people who will trust you are out in your community. You just have to find them. I'm grateful for what the women taught me in those slums, and I hope it helps you too. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you. Thank you.